So thank you all for joining us for this special event, this special collaborative event. So this year we've been engaging in a series of conversations titled Insurgent Intersections, Combating Global Anti-Blackness. And this project is taking multiple forms. We had a keynote speech last fall with Dr. Leslie Alexander. And we've had some works in progress, of which some members who have participated in that are here as well. And this event is a collaborative event with the Black Latinx Americas xLab in Latino and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers. And so just to give you a quick background, my name is Shanti Rosado. I'm an assistant professor in Africana Studies with an appointment also in Latino and Caribbean Studies. And the Insurgent Intersection Project is really aiming at looking at the roots of global anti-Blackness as well as its modern day iterations. And we're really focused on trying to figure out potential solutions as we move into the future. We are interested in forms of knowledge that come from outside of the academy. And so while, the talks, for example, are works in progress and a lot of our discussions have been academic in nature, we're always very much attuned to what's happening outside of the academy and wanting to bring that in as time goes on. So today we're going to be talking with Dr. Pablo José López Oro, and I'll give you a quick introduction to Pablo's work. And as we do that, Jenny, it says that Omaris is still not able to join as a panelist. She is an attendee. I don't know if we would be able to let her unmute herself as an attendee, but if we could figure that out, that'd be great. So just a quick introduction to Pablo's work. So Dr. Pablo José López Oro is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Smith College. He teaches courses on Black Latin American and US Black Latinx social movements, Black diaspora theories and ethnographies, and Black feminisms / queer theory. He's working on his first book manuscript entitled Hemispheric Black Indigeneity, The Queer Politics of Self-Making, Garifuna, New York, a transdisciplinary study analyzing oral histories, performances, social media, film, literary texts, and visual cultures to unearth the political, intellectual, cultural, and spiritual genealogies of Garifuna women and subaltern geographies of Garifuna LGBTQ+ folks at the forefront of Garifuna transnational movements in New York City. Hemispheric Black Indigeneity offers new ways to approach questions on the multiple ways in which Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent queerly negotiate, perform, contradict, and articulate their Black, Indigenous, and Latinx subjectivities. So I will pass it on before we get to Pablo. I will pass it to Omaris so she can quickly introduce the Black Latinx Americas xLab.
Hi, everyone. I apologize. Zoom hates me. Rutgers Zoom officially hates me. Like, I could never log on. People send links without passcodes, like another, not this event, but other events, and I could never get on. I tried 5 minutes early to hop on here. It just does not love me, right? It just doesn't. So I highly, highly apologize for that. But I am here, and welcome, Dr. Pablo López Oro. It is a pleasure to have you join us and to do this collaboration with Insurgent Intersections, the Black Latinx Americas xLab, which is housed in the Latino Caribbean Studies Department. And I co-run it with my colleague, Dr. Saide Lindsay Flores, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. But I'm really excited to have you, that you shared your work with us. And so we're really excited because the Black Latinx Americas xLab is all about, right, doing very similar work, but also thinking about, right, thinking alongside scholars, right, who are doing work in the Black Latinx Americas, right, very much hemispheric work, right, like yours, Pablo. And it's really about coming into a space where you can present your work, workshop your work, and think aloud, right, with folks. And so that's kind of the synopsis of what we do here at the Black Latinx Americas xLab, and it's always a pleasure to collaborate and co-sponsor and to be part of these conversations. So I'll pause there because I want to make make sure we have enough time to talk about your work, Pablo, and hear more from your perspective.
Wonderful. And without further ado, let's hear from the one and only, our distinguished guest, Pablo José López Oro.
Sorry, thank you. No, absolutely. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Seremain. I'm incredibly grateful to be in this space today. Just want to give a huge shout out to colleagues at Rutgers in the Department of Africana Studies and the Black Latinx Americas xLab. Especially a lot of love to Professors Butler, Rosado, Britton, Zamora, Dince Flores. I'm incredibly always in awe of your generosity and your kindness. And I'm excited to kind of, talk about this very, very much rough draft of the book chapter that I'm still working through. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to just be vulnerable, right? And to kind of just air it all out, and happy to have a conversation about it. I did really wanted to kind of start with this image that you see in front of you, particularly because this image is really emerging at a multicultural moment in Honduras's kind of racial discourse. And this is an image from the mid 2000s, 2010, 2011. And I actually, for the folks who may not have access to the paper, to the draft, I kind of want to just share the abstract to kind of guide my thinking, but also guide the conversation for today. So for today, I want to talk about this chapter that I'm thinking through, titled The Afterlives of Mestizaje, Hemispheric Anti-Blackness, and Black Indigenous Life. Black Central American histories, cultures, politics, and communities remain invisible and peripheral in the United States and on the Isthmus. Central America's nation-building racial discourse of mestizaje continues to enact epistemological violence onto Black Central Americans throughout the Americas. Central American mestizaje as an anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racial project haunts Black Central American political mobilization, activism, and struggles for not simply state recognition, but an echoing of hashtag La Vida Negras Importan. Borrowing from Saidiya Hartman's trailblazing concept on the afterlife of slavery, I build on how mestizaje as an institutionalized racial project in Central America and its diasporas in the United States marks an unfinished aftermath that continues to this very day. In this chapter, I turn to the transgenerational, political, cultural, intellectual activism of Garifuna New Yorkers to conjure, carve, and create a hemispheric space for Black Indigenous life in the face of mestizaje's anti-Blackness. In the United States, the invocation of Central America conjures a set of racial and political imaginaries that centers mestizos, indigenous cultures, revolutionary movements, civil wars, and US occupations that at times eclipse the discussion of race and racism in the region and its diasporas. In Central America, race and racism is obscured by the ghosts of mestizaje as an imagined racial mixture, birthing a mythical racial sameness bounded by nationalism. Within Central American mestizaje, Blackness is relegated, alienated, and ascribed to the Caribbean coast, erasing centuries of Black folks in the interior and Pacific coast. By ascribing Blackness and Black people to Central America's Caribbean coast, mestizaje constructs its imaginary in opposition to and in negation of Blackness, especially when the Caribbean coast is understood to be removed from the national public spaces of mestizo governance. For example, Managua or Tegucigalpa, which are on the Pacific coast, are imagined to be non-Black spaces. So in other words, one of the things that I'm thinking through here in particular, and I do actually want to spend a bit time flushing out or even discussing, right, the racial project of mestizaje within a Central American worldview, right? So in other words, mestizaje is not a universal racial project in Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Central America in particular has a very specific project around mestizaje that is strictly, right, about Spanish conquistadores and indigenous women, right? And that produces, right? So this moment of conquest, this moment of sexual violence, this gendered sexual violence of conquest, right? Births the mestizo national subject. And what's really quite literally not necessarily unique, but what's intentional about Central American mestizaje is the negation of the African root, right? So in Mexico, we'll hear la tercera raza or la tercera raíz, right? There's an understanding of mestizaje in the Caribbean as also incorporating, right? Having the presence of Afro-descendant people, African culture, right? But one thing about Central America, and let me go ahead and just geographically situate us, right? Because what I'm particularly thinking about in the context of Central American mestizaje, and I'm also interested in talking about, because in the chapter in particular, I think about mestizaje not simply as something that happened at the moment right after the Wars of Independence of 1821, and it's this project of nation building, but how mestizaje remains quite intact, even, right? Even with the hemispheric projects of Black and Indigenous communities in Latin America fighting for recognition, right? So this is, I obviously turn to the work of Tiana Paschal, Juliet Hooker, Edmund T. Gordon to really kind of think about what is it about multiculturalism that keeps mestizaje intact, right? And this is where I'm thinking about geographies of anti-Blackness in Central America's Caribbean coast, because one incredibly important construction and discourse that's happening with Central America's Caribbean coast is that Blackness is relegated to the Caribbean, right? That in Central America, the only possible places of locating Blackness is on the Black Atlantic, right? And that quite literally makes Black folks and Blackness and Black culture not only peripheral to the nation state, but it also makes Black folks alien to the nation state, right? And particularly the mestizo nation state, right? That Black people come from somewhere else, right? That West Indian Central Americans come from somewhere else. That Garifuna folks come from St. Vincent, right? That British colonialism, right? i.e. Bluefields, Nicaragua, that happens because they're coming from Jamaica or they're coming from some English-speaking part of the Caribbean, right? Black people in Central America are not part of Central America, right? They're constantly alien, they're constantly foreign. And in fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically the anti-Blackness in Honduras around the racialized geographies, particularly because there's this common discourse in Honduras that goes very quotidian. En Tegucigalpa se estudia, en San Pedro Sula se trabaja, y en La Ceiba se parranda, right? In Tegucigalpa you study, in San Pedro Sula you work, in La Ceiba you party. Now, La Ceiba is on the coast, Tegucigalpa is in the Pacific, San Pedro Sula is relatively close to the coast, but it's the industrial capitals where all the maquilas are at. And one of the things about this really popular Honduran saying, it indicates about the various geographies in Honduras. The Caribbean coast is constructed as a space of dance, leisure, good times, libations, and sexual opportunities. Honduras is imagined as a mestizo nation state. So like the rest of Central America, Honduras's myth of racial mixing is centered on the romanticized heterosexual masculine colonial union between a heroic Spanish male conquistador and submissive, docile, feminine indigenous woman. This racialized, gendered, and sex mestizo discourse that negates an African presence and contribution is central to the construction of the Honduran national subject. So for what I'm arguing in this particular chapter is that Blackness is ascribed to and always only located on the Caribbean coast, right? What's really actually really important here is that it also simultaneously negates and erases and silences the multiple and diverse histories of Black Central Americans, right? So in other words, there's a rich history of Black diaspora in Central America, yet mestizaje constructs this notion that Black people are only coming from the Caribbean, right? As if Black people had not been for centuries already in the interior. And I'm also thinking about the work of Darío Urraque, who talks a lot about what would it mean to actually resurrect the history of slavery, right? In Honduras and the rest of Central America. It would really destabilize this consistent narrative that Black people only exist on the Caribbean coast, right? We would understand that Black geographies exist also in the Pacific and also in the interior. And one thing about and feel free, like if anybody wants to let me know on time, because I will go. But one thing about this in particular is I spend time here flushing out the anti-Blackness in Central America's Caribbean coast, because it quite literally travels, right, to the United States, right? And this traveling is really important for the broader project around my book, right? So the book is Indigenous Blackness in the Americas, the Queer Politics of Self-Making Garifuna, New York. I really begin the book on March 25th, 1990, with David Dinkins and the Happy Land Social Club. And the reason I start there, because it's the catalyst to Garifuna New Yorkers' visibility, right? It's the moment, it's this tragic moment, this tragic fire that happens on Southern Boulevard in the Bronx, and 87, mostly Garifuna of Honduran, Guatemalan descent, pass away in this really tragic fire. And here's this hemispheric mobilization around recovering and remembering the dead in that moment. But here's also David Dinkins really tapping into also a community that was very unfamiliar with, learns about, and really pushes Garifuna New Yorkers to create a civic space for them within the city, right? So this is where you see the development of Garifuna bilingual education programs in the Bronx, in Harlem, in Brownsville, in Canarsie, in East New York. This is also where you see Garifuna Day as the celebration in downtown and City Hall, right? This is also kind of the moment where multiculturalism, right? So one thing about Dinkins' administration in particular, right, which is really fascinating, is that Dinkins in many ways really builds a public space for Black immigrants in the city, right? And he uses Garifuna folks as a prime example of what we see on Eastern Parkway, right? What we see on Labor Day for the Eastern Parkway. And the reason I begin there, besides the catalyst, it also tells us a story around the invisibility around Black Central Americans in New York City, but it also tells us a story of how the activism that Garifuna women and LGBTQ identified Garifuna folks are at the forefront. So I spend time flushing in this chapter, which is essentially that fourth chapter where I'm thinking about refashioning Afro-Latinidad, because in many ways, Garifuna folks are rejecting Afro-Latinidad, right? For Garifuna New Yorkers, Afro-Latinidad in many ways is a very fraught and complicated project, right? And it's a project that they don't easily fold into. And I think what's really important about thinking about the afterlives of Mestizaje is that Mestizaje stays intact, right? Mestizaje produces these images, right? Mestizaje creates these constructions and places Garifuna folks, Creole folks, other Black Central Americans into a caricature for the state. It also places Garifuna folks, right, into this moment of inclusion, right? But what kind of inclusion, right? And the kind of inclusion that we see here is one rooted, right, not only in land dispossession in the context of Central America, but we also see how Mestizaje creates these conditions even in New York City, right? So the afterlife of Mestizaje as an institution, right? The very idea of mestizo multiculturalism, which I'm building off of the work of Juliet Hooker, is to really think about, well, what does it mean to actually include Black and Indigenous communities into the racial discourse of Mestizaje through a lens of multiculturalism, right? Through the performance of culture, right? Through the performance of folklore, right? What does it also mean to have the branding of UNESCO, right? UNESCO as this Garifuna folks, Garifuna language, Garifuna culture and history as this masterpiece of intangible humanity. There's a certain kind of branding, right, that's happening in the afterlife of Mestizaje. And I think one of the things about Central American Mestizaje, which is really distinct from other versions of Mestizaje throughout Latin America, is that Mestizaje literally in Central America has to exist in the very negation of Black folks. That in fact, Mestizaje in Central America doesn't work until we have this negation, right? And the negation is The negation for me in this part is about geography. The negation is also about understanding the presence of Garifuna, Creole, and other Black Central American communities existing centuries before the formation of the Republic. But this also ties deeply into why, sorry, I'm like jumping around with the text. Janelle Martinez, right, who is a Garifuna New Yorker, and for all of our sociological imagination, a second generation Garifuna New Yorker, right? Born and raised in the Bronx, parents are from Honduras, has traveled to Honduras, grows up in the Bronx. But this is also why you have a generation of Janelle Martinezes saying, negra soy, why I've moved away from the term Afro-Latina, right? Because the term Afro-Latina, right, in the worldview of Garifuna New Yorkers in particular, feels and seems as an add-on, right? As an add-on to a project that very much negates the existence of Janelle Martinez, of the Luz Solis, right? And I think it's important to think about specifically Central America, how that project of Mestizaje is deeply rooted in the anti-Blackness, right, of its formation, of its calculations, right? And it has a lot to do not simply with national belonging, but it also has a lot to do with the space that Garifuna folks and other Black Central Americans are carving within a category that doesn't necessarily was necessarily created for the existence of Black and Indigenous people, right? So in this chapter, I put Janelle Martinez in conversation with Ida Lambert, who is born in Honduras, comes to Brooklyn and then East Harlem in the 60s, and is the first and only, to this day, the only Black woman to be part of a Desfile de la Hispanidad. She's a founding committee member, and she is someone who generationally is advocating for the presence of Centroamericana, Negra Centroamericana. She's very much invested in creating visibility, creating recognition, creating a space for Black Central Americans within a Desfile de la Hispanidad that was very much very white and very mestizo in New York. So I think there's an interesting transgenerational conversation that happens, as well as Mirta Colón, who is quite literally a very iconic Garifuna New Yorker activist. She's one of she's very much the Miriam Miranda of New York City, right? And within the Garifuna community, because she's been not only since the late 70s, right? She's created multiple cultural institutions in the South Bronx that are focused on the preservation of Black Indigenous life, right? So she has Garifuna languages in Casa Yurumain, right? At 874 Prospect Avenue, right? Every Saturday you can go learn a little bit of Buiti Pinapi. And that's important, right? That political move is important. It's particularly important because it allows for a disruption as well, right? A disruption to who is Central American, right? It allows for a disruption within the city, also understanding Black indigeneity in a really different way, right? And also in particular, there's something incredibly hemispheric when it comes to Mirta, when it comes to Aida, and when it comes to Janelle, even though all three are rooted in New York City, right? And this is where it becomes incredibly important to think about how the afterlife of Mestizaje is really shaping this activism, is really pushing this activism forward. So I want to kind of leave it there. I'm happy to answer all the questions. I'm also happy to talk more about Central American Mestizaje, but I'm also happy to talk more about the activism of Janelle, of Aida and Mirta in particular. And also in this chapter, I talk about Zulma, who's also, right, a Garifuna New Yorker, born in Honduras, comes in the 80s. And it's really important into this kind of public discourse around Pelo Malo no existe, right? Black hair does not exist. So I wanna open up the space for folks to ask questions, to help me think through some stuff, but also in particular, I want to keep in mind that Central American mestizaje in particular, both on the isthmus and its diaspora, is still intact, right? That even though there's these, you know, Nicaragua in 1987 is the first Latin American country to recognize Black and Indigenous peoples in their constitution, right? Nicaragua literally models for the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, what would it mean to actually include Black and Indigenous peoples in their constitution? Yet Creole folks, Garifuna folks, right, Mosquito folks in Central America's Caribbean coast remained dispossessed, remained marginalized within governance, right, remained also in the belly of anti-Blackness and certainly anti-Indigeneity. So thank you so much. I'd love to hear folks' comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for giving us that background and for your amazing work. So the way that we've started these conversations is that we like to include, you know, all the panelists are going to be included, but we would like to start with seeing if there are any graduate students who have questions, comments, suggestions. So yeah, anybody who feels called. Feel free.
Come on, call. Yes. I love it.
I'm like, I have a ton of questions, so.
And also also feel free to like, obviously push me forward and all of this stuff, but I also, one of the things about this chapter that I'm also kind of like, you know, struggling with, right, but also really thinking through is that Central American mestizaje is so distinctive from other projects of mestizaje, right, that in fact, and you know, growing up in Bushwick, right, growing up with New Yorkers, growing up with Dominicans, you could see the project in itself so different, right, that in fact, I remember always, right, being told by my parents, don't let anyone call you Moreno, don't let anyone call you Negro. And New Yorkers and Dominicans just say like, buenos dias, right? And it's like, oh, okay, this is a different project, right? That this is a different relationship to Blackness, that this is also a really different, right? Because even in Honduras, right, I mean, Moreno is not a positive term, right? And in fact, Moreno becomes Morenales, right? So when mestizos talk about Black people, right? Essentially, the term Morenales emerges as this anti-Black term to literally say, that's where all the Black folks live, right? And it's not an endearing term, right? So I'm happy to think through more about that because I think, and you can see Central American mestizaje really present in even discourses around US Central Americans, right? And you can also see the complexities around West Indian Panamanians, West Indian Belizeans, West Indian Hondurans, right? There's this complicated tension between British colonialism and Central American mestizaje. I was really lucky to study and learn under Juliet Hooker, who's a Creole Nicaraguan woman from Bluefields, who really helped me to think through these things, right? Because I think there's something about Central American mestizaje that always performs this idea of multiculturalism, right? With the caveat that Blackness has to always be a folklore, that it always has to become a folkloric culture, right? That there's something about Black people that has to become, you know, everybody, you know, and I think about Paul Mooney a lot every time I think about this chapter because sopa de caracol, right? Everybody wants to dance punta, right? But no one wants to say that punta is Garifuna, right? Everyone wants to say punta is Honduran, right? Punta is not Honduran. Punta is not Belizean. Punta is not Guatemalan. It's not Nicaraguan, right? It's Garifuna. It's from St. Vincent, right? And in fact, punta is incredibly sacred for ancestral memory, right? And one of the things about that, and this is the failed project of multiculturalism, in order for Garifuna folks, both in Central America and the US, to be digestible to Central American mestizaje, this kind of folkloric representation and caricature of Black Indigenous culture has to be consumed, right? And it has to be performed. So yeah, sorry, I went on a little bit.
No, don't be sorry. So if we could, Jenny, if you could add Tatiana to the panelists. And I see that Dr. Butler has their hand up, and but I will start with Henry since he is the grad student. So let's start with Henry, and then we will go over to Dr. Butler. Thank you.
Hey, but thank you, and thank you for this really illuminating paper and presentation. I work on stuff that's very far, somewhat far geographically, but very far temporally. But one thing that jumped out at me in your paper was, so you talk about labor specifically twice in ways that were really interesting that I would love to hear more about, whether you expand upon that elsewhere in your work or whether it's something you're interested in expanding upon more here. So it comes up in the paper in two different contexts. First, broadly, in the broader political economy of Central America, the Caribbean, America, the ways in which the exploitation of labor, migrant labor, the labor economy plays into politics, political power, ethnogenesis, what have you. And you also talk about it as, it appears really strikingly in one of your images as a way of asserting Garifuna identity. And I found that really interesting. And so I guess it's partly in keeping with sort of the theme of roots of anti-Blackness and sort of real action in the world. I'm curious as to what your work might offer as an opportunity for us to think about how labor, even in circumstances where on the one hand, labor in the broader political economy creates conditions of confinement and control, how labor can also serve as a force for liberation, for cultural memory, because it seems like there's a lot of really, I read a lot about like labor practices and sort of the handiwork people do. And it seems like there's a really distinctive, fascinating, and important economic and cultural history there. So I would love to hear more about it. Thank you again.
No, thank you for that. I really appreciate the question. So that my look into labor and my focus on labor is one that builds from the work of Kristen Smith, particularly kind of her work around Beatriz Nacimiento, particularly because I think there's something around Black Indigenous women's labor and Black Indigenous queer folks' labor that gets marked as not only invisible, but not theoretical, not intellectual, not spiritual, not ancestral, not political enough, right? And I want to emphasize that because one of the things about the project of Garifuna, New York, or even the project of Garifunanes, right? That could quite literally not exist without the labor that Garifuna women have been doing for quite literally centuries, right? And that's not an exaggeration, right? That's not an exaggeration on the historical record. When I think about Black life in Central America, Marcus Garvey's is not the only oldest Black Central American organization, right? The first UNIA in Limón, Costa Rica, but OFRANE, Organización Fraternal Negra de Honduras, emerges in the collective of Garifuna women, right, on the Caribbean coast of Honduras in the 50s. So this is the work that, you know, I turn to labor in a really specific way, and I name that labor, right? I named the labor that Janelle Martinez does, that Ida Lambert in the 90s, La Única Negra, en el desfile de la Hispanidad, right? Like to literally be in a space where she has, right, these comrades that are Spanish speaking, but are literally pushing back with their anti-Blackness, right? Are consistently pushing back to her and not letting her really mobilize. And this is also in many ways why she leaves the desfile de la Hispanidad. And she's also kind of within the Latinidad of New York, really forgotten, right? She's entirely forgotten, right? She doesn't show up in el Museo del Barrio. She doesn't show up in el Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños. She doesn't show up in the Chamber, right? She's kind of incredibly invisibilized, right? And that has everything to do with her Black Central American activism in that space where she's really pushing. So I turn to labor in that sense, right? Like I want to not only place where credit is credit due, but like we also deeply have to understand that one thing about Garifuna culture too is it's matrilineal, right? As most African diaspora communities are, right? Yet within the matrilineal of Garifuna-ness, right? Homophobia, transphobia, musanajwar, like very present, right? Very present in a ref, right? This is also why you have these kind of public images of Garifuna men at the forefront of cultural preservation when it's actually Garifuna women and queer Garifuna folks, right? And this is also why I turn a lot to geographies, right? Because it's these intimate geographies of the kitchen, of the porch, of a living room, of a basement of a church on Mother Gaston Boulevard, right? Like one of the oldest Garifuna dance companies, which is actually started by a Garifuna lesbian woman who left Honduras because of anti-Blackness and homophobia, is one that is about like the intimacy of doing this in a Pentecostal church on Mother Gaston Boulevard, right? Like that's labor, right? That's labor. And she does this in connection with Medgar Evers College. And so I want to honor that labor as intellectual, as cultural, as spiritual, as political. Thank you, Henry.
Dr. Butler?
Okay, I'm just so excited about this project. I appreciate how much you are trying to get in this. And it was interesting when you gave your overview of the chapters, because I really did want to see what the whole project looks like. And one of the things that was striking me was that it does seem like what we saw seems like it's a little bit of what you presented as chapters 4 and 5. And I wasn't sure about that, because I was very conscious of moving through different kinds of spaces. I will say this, that the theme of invisibility is really crystal clear. And it's really wonderful the way it holds together every single one of those spaces that you move through, because that's the one constant. It's always this pressure to, you know, to make some people invisible and their pressure to be seen. So that works really well. I was wondering, I mean, I have lots of notes I'll give you separately, but I was just wondering how you might steer us through these spaces, because there were some points where it's like, oh, I wish we could just stay in Central America for a minute longer before we go back to New York. But then I said, well, there is also something to be said. Maybe you're doing this deliberately, is moving us back and forth to give us this sort of constant motion between the, which could really work nicely. But you know, in each one of those spaces, I know that you have to introduce people to the issues at stake, but then I wanted to push you to go a little bit further, because I know you're already dealing with a lot of new ones, but there is more.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the things that particularly struck me was what's happening to Belize in this. Because one of the ways that you were talking about a lot of the ways people position themselves. And one of them is very clearly language, right? You know, the deployment of language. And that's going to be different in Honduras than in Belize.
No, absolutely.
And it's also going to be different when those people come to the States. And I was just wishing to see a little bit more of that tackled, because so there's that. So you know what all that's involved. And I know there's a lot of other people with hands up, so I'm not going to go too long, but I just want to say one thing that really, really struck me. And this was, I think, your Señora Aida, the one who was at the Honduras. I said, it was so interesting to me that she's doing all this. Now she has chosen to kind of represent herself within the Central American thing, right? And so I said, well, she had a choice. She could have gone in there with her Garifuna colors or the Honduras colors. She goes in there with the Honduras colors.
Yes.
And I just wanted you to kind of sit with us, open that up for the readers. Yeah. So we can really sit with that significance of that, because that's her entree. To the, in a particular way. And the one last thing I will say about this whole creation of the memorializing of the thing is, and this is something I learned when I was studying museums, is that that only happens when people perceive the culture to be disappearing.
Yes.
And
yes.
so there's that too. But anyway,
Yes.
I'm gonna cut it short so that you can answer and other people can get a chance to get in. But I just want to say, I love this so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm fangirling real hard right now. So thank you. I appreciate the comments and the questions. And thank you for pushing me forward, because one thing that I very much still struggle with is how do I stay hemispheric on the page, right? And I think that for me, because one thing is I'm also very much not interested in assimilation conversations in a sociological lens, right? Like I'm not really interested in these larger debates of first gen, second gen, 1.5, 1.6, all of these conversations. And I think for me, the flows and the movements and the migrations, both discursively and physically and social media, help me to think through, let's get beyond this sociological fixation around generations. And how does Janelle Martinez, born in the Bronx, Ida Lambert, Mirta Colon, Zulma, born in Honduras, but have their formative years in New York City, are in constant hemispheric conversation, right? And what's that happening? Belize comes up, and it's actually, I'm very attuned to Belize coming up, particularly because within Central America, Belize and Panama get regulated, right, by other mestizo Central American nation states as not Central American enough, right? And that has everything to do with the fact that Belize and Panama are Black spaces, right, are Black nation states, right? And particularly with the Creole and the West Indian diaspora in Belize and Panama, it really distinguishes them in that sense. Belize in particular, in the context of New York City, you really don't have a lot of Belizean Garifunas in Spanish-speaking spaces, right? So Belizean Garifunas fold to West Indian Brooklyn, right? They fold in to, and this is where language comes out really strong, right? Because in fact, Ida, right, in that memoir that that Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores puts beautifully together for the Afro-Latino reader, I read that all the time and I'm like, yeah, Ida's making a strategic move to be in the company of Spanish-speaking folks. And she actually, for me, and I read this and I'm always constantly happy to talk about this, but I read a lot of her comments around African-American people and culture as being anti-African-American, right? Which is not an uncommon narrative around Black immigrants, right, in the US. And Jemima Pierre's phenomenal work really reminds us of this. But there's something about Ida's generation and Mirta's generation that are folding in to Hispanidad, right? There's something about Latinidad that promises inclusion in the 80s and 90s. Janelle's generation is like, oh no, right? Janelle's generation is cancel Latinidad, right? And I love her for that, in particular because she folds in to a diasporic Blackness that allows her to attend an HBCU, that allows her to feel at home in a Delta sorority, right? In an African-American sorority where she feels loved and supported and in kinship, right? And I think there's something generationally really different there. That's the only moment where I'm kind of interested in the generational, I don't want to call it divide, but difference, right? Because Janelle is growing up in a different moment with Latinidad, right? And the cancellation of Latinidad is an interesting one, but there's something much more interesting about wanting to cancel Afro-Latinidad because it's not a project that does enough work to center Blackness, right? So I think there's something there. Also, I also want to echo the work of Nicole Ramsey, who does work on Creole Belizeans and Garifuna Belizeans in Los Angeles. And I think Belize is always really fascinating to me, both in a personal level, because my paternal line is a generation removed from Honduras and it's from Dangriga, Belize, right? So Paul Joseph is not, folks coming in the 80s and wanting to Americanize me. Paul Joseph is generations of Belizean Garifunas who like, oh, we left Honduras and we got Spanish names, but it don't rock in Belize and it doesn't rock in New York. So let's make sure the firstborn in the US has an English name, right? So my grandfather is Pablo José, right? Paul Joseph is my government name, right? And I think there's something important in those distinctions and those negotiations. But I definitely want to be able to stay in these spaces. And, you know, for me, Central America in the overall book project, the only moment I'm physically, ethnographically in Central America is during Garifuna Settlement Day. So chapter 2, where I turn to like performing Indigenous Blackness, because Belize is the first place where Garifuna Settlement Day happens in 1974. So, and then the second place is Brooklyn, right? So here you have these two moments where I want to be able to physically be in Central America, but I also want to also articulate the discursive presence of Central America in New York City, right? And how Central America's Caribbean coast is being brought to Mother Gaston Boulevard, is being brought to Southern Boulevard in the Bronx, right? It's being brought to the Schomburg, right? When the Schomburg has these Garifuna dance companies with bomba performances, right? And how there's a Botanica on 116th and Lenox that's, you know, Lexington, that's both owned by an Afro-Puerto Riqueño and a Garifuna Honduran woman, right? Like at the intersections of what Richard Eiten calls the diasporic Mecca. So thank you so much, Professor Butler. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much. So before I move on, just a quick note, for folks who are attending and aren't on the screen right now, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box, because we will be addressing those in a little bit. So add your questions as we go along, and then, hopefully we get to all of those at the end of this discussion. And also, I don't know who's the doctor, who's not, so I'm just gonna go with first names from here on out. Emma, would you let us know what questions you had, question suggestions?
I'm Emma. I'm actually one of Tatiana's PhD students. So I have been actually, Pablo, I've been following your work since the that Critical Latinx Indigeneities Forum with the Latinx Project. So
oh, thank you.
Yeah, I was extremely excited when I saw this pop up, and I was just, really looking forward to hearing from you and reading and all of this. So I have probably a more relatively basic question. I actually have a question that is a little more focused on terminology. So, I've been looking at kind of this term of Latinx, Latina itself in kind of my own work. And I really liked the way that you described, it was in a footnote in the paper, but why you choose to use Afro-Latinx with no space, or Afro-Latinidad being just kind of that one larger word with no hyphen. And there's, as you know, there's power in language, in text, punctuation, etc. So my kind of actual question then is, I also noticed that later on you used the term of Afro-Indigeneity with the hyphen. So it wasn't like explicitly stated. So I was just curious, where do you draw that conceptual, that literary difference between what's happening there and what's happening with your kind of usage of Afro-Latinx instead?
Absolutely. And I want to just also thank you so much for the question. I also want to just give a shout out and verbal citation to Professor Omari Zamora, right? Jomaira Figueroa Vasquez, who have been incredible interlocutors to help me think about the hyphen, right? And the violence of the hyphen, right? In particular with the violence of the hyphen, Blackness within, for us who are thinking that Blackness and indigeneity are foundational to Latinidad, the hyphen actually reinscribes the violence of just simply adding on Blackness onto this project that is quite literally an anti-Black project, right? So I want to just, Profe Zamora and Profe Figueroa Vasquez, thank you so much for that. The thing about the Afro-indigeneity is also my having to negotiate and navigate the literature, right? So a lot of the literature on Garifuna folks, which, you know, in many ways is really dominated by anthropologists, right? Mark Anderson, Sarah England, Paul Christopher Johnson, you know, they all do the Afro-indigeneity or Afro-indigenous and Afro-indigenous, and even Garifuna activists and other Black Indigenous activists use it. You know, I didn't get to do it in this draft, but I'm really pushing back to it because one of the things that I'm trying to contribute in the conversation around Black indigeneity is what would it mean for us to understand African descended folks who survived the Middle Passage to be indigenous in the Americas. So in other words, when Omi Sheikh and Natasha Tinsley tells us that at the bottom of the Black Atlantic is the queer Atlantic, well, what would it mean for us to also think that at the bottom of the Black Atlantic is also the Black Indigenous Atlantic, right? And I think there's something incredibly important when I look at the work of even Francia Marquez, right, in Colombia, where she talks about her ancestors coming in 1521, right? And La Toma being her ancestral land because she's indigenous to the land, right? And I think there's something about indigenous Blackness that can offer us a different terrain to understanding that Afro-indigenous, right? Or Afro-indigeneity. And that's what I'm really kind of pushing theoretically for the book, to really help us think through what would it really mean for us to deeply understand Black folks in the Americas, to be indigenous to the Americas, right? Who gets disrupted, what gets disrupted, what articulations, formations of Blackness do we expand on? Do we completely fold into, right? And quite literally blow up, right? Because I'm interested in always blowing up borders and compartmentalizations, right? And I think Garifuna folks have always modeled that for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, Tatiana.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I'm also a huge fangirl and really been enjoying following your work. And so I don't know how much you know about my research, but I'm an art historian and I began my career thinking about Mexico. And when I got to Rutgers, and I've been at Rutgers since 2007, I joined the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies, a little bit because the deans didn't know that what I worked on wasn't really either Latino or Caribbean. And so I became a Caribbeanist by virtue of my new academic home. And so I was really struck by the disconnect between these two spaces as entities that are geographically, obviously not, but somehow they're conceptually distinct, geographically connected, but still super distinct. So I see some of that coming out in your work, where if you sort of think more about mainland continental spaces in Latin America, like Mexico and the Andes, ultimately I don't think that the mestizaje discourse in Central America is as different perhaps as you might think, and it might be because your kind of cohort growing up was more of a kind of Caribbean idea of mestizaje. Whereas in Mexico, the mestizaje, meaning union of indigenous and Spaniard, is built in to the country's founding DNA. Anti-Blackness is built in as well. And in Central America, and what you show of Central America is where you really see that, the two pulling apart. And part of the reason, again, when I started thinking about the Caribbean, I was struck by the invisibility of the indigenous peoples in Caribbean discourse. And I've written about that a little bit, about the categories. And then similarly, thinking about Latin America, the invisibility of Black people. And so I always think about this sort of push and pull of Blackness and indigeneity. And when one is foregrounded, the other one gets erased. So the way that you're thinking about Black indigeneity is incredibly productive and generative for me. I would maybe suggest looking more closely at Fanon. In Wretched of the Earth, he writes about natives, and he's very sort of clearly like thinking differently, you know, being in Algeria and other kind of the other hemisphere around differently from Blackness. And Sylvia Wynter also says that the Black people become the natives of the New World. And so I remember like originally reading them and sort of finding it sort of, I don't know, shocking. I don't know how I would describe my reaction. Of course, tremendously productive, but I think it was that the way that like recent conversations have been balancing both sides, that is incredibly, the potential of it in your work is incredible, especially just because you know so much that you know, as a Latin American, as Central America is tremendously invisible to me. And I've been making a concerted effort to learn more. And I was recently in El Salvador for the first time, and conversations there, like the idea of Black erasure, like it's, I see Latinx Salvadoran artists who clearly have Black ancestry, but they're all about like indigeneity, or you know, some kind of like mestizo project that's amorphous. I even was talking to somebody from El Salvador who'd never heard the expression Pelo Malo, that amazing book that you show. And so that, you know, that level of like lack of like consciousness of Black people, it is jarring. And of course, you know, in other spaces where there are very visibly Black people, that somehow they're not Latin American, they're Caribbean, they're like not national citizens. So so again, just sort of in a just to wrap it up, I think going back somewhat to like the book Finding Afro-Mexico by Theodore Cohen about erasure of Mexicans from a national consciousness. But to me, it's like, it's prevalent, and it's actually what defines Latin America, the way that Blackness is erased, and the only spaces where it can exist are like maybe Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, that are both Caribbean and Latin America somehow. But yeah, a lot of really incredible material that you're working with, and I'm a huge fan of Janelle. So thank you.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate you bringing up El Salvador, because one of the things about El Salvador gets to say that Black people don't exist because they don't have the Caribbean coast, right? And actually, the anti-Blackness within El Salvador really helped my argument around Blackness as alien to Central America, because with the absence of the Caribbean coast, they get to say, aquí no hay negros, right? Where there's clearly, most certainly Afro-Salvadorians, right? And the Pacific coast is very much part of, you know, the Pacific coast is the Black Pacific, right? So yeah, thank you for that comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. There's a question in the chat. If someone could answer that for me, I would really appreciate it. It's just for the hosts and panelists. So my comments, I had a couple of comments, and really the first one that kind of like stands out is that I feel like there are more similarities across like Caribbean, Latin American, Central American spaces in terms of mestizaje and Blackness than I feel like you're letting on. So even in your discussion around like, you know, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans saying negro, right? Like that's always used in a very specific, like, oh, it's a term of endearment, but you don't ever let anyone call you negro in like an actual way of like naming your Blackness, because then that's offensive, right? And so I think there's actual similarities there, right, across space that really matter, right? Because there's it's like, man, the code book is the same everywhere. They're using the same tools. So I'm wondering about those like similarities. Another similarity that stood out for me was the foreignization of Blackness, which I think happens everywhere, right? So like in PR, it's like, oh, los negros son dominicanos. In DR, los negros son haitianos. You know, anywhere that you can find, it's like the foreignization. And then if it's not an outside country from which you're receiving immigration, it's usually just a specific location, like in Colombia. Oh, they're on the Pacific coast and that's it. Or in your case, they're on the Caribbean coast and that's it. So it's the foreignization, but also kind of the, you know, the isolation or marginal, geographical isolation of Blackness that allows us to keep it right from that, the ideas of the nation, as you point out. But my question was about, I really love your engagement with Saidiya Hartman and Afterlives of Slavery. And so I'm wondering how, in talking about, you know, the Afterlives of Mestizaje or the haunting of Mestizaje, is it really an after, right? Because I'm wondering in the case of slavery, which, you know, Saidiya Hartman has a reason to say, like, okay, we have abolition and then we have everything after it, which is the afterlife. With Mestizaje, I think you're implying that multiculturalism in, you know, in these constitutions presented a rupture in Mestizaje. And I think I just need more evidence to support that, because I don't really think that's the case personally. I think it was just a band-aid to allow them to keep doing the same things they've always been doing. But so yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on what the after means when we're thinking about Mestizaje.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And 100% on the Band-Aid, right? Multiculturalism in the context of Latin America is the Band-Aid, right? In many ways, the reason I turn to Hartman a lot is because Hartman has helped me to think about what is it about the very institution of slavery and the very institution of Mestizaje that keeps anti-Blackness at the center of not only its discourse, but of its life, right? So this is why I opened up today's conversation with that image, right? That image is a postcard that's produced by the Department of Culture and Tourism in Honduras, right? That image is incredibly anti-Black, right? That image also creates a caricature of Garifuna folks in Honduras that places them on the beach, on their ancestral land, that is to this very day in consistent, constant dispossession. Yet Garifuna culture is sold, is commodified, right? It's fetishized. It's literally market, right? It's a hashtag. And I think for me, Hartman really helps me to think about what is it about slavery, the institution, the social architecture of slavery that remains intact, right? And this is where she really helps me to think about life expectancy, right? Housing, education, right? All of these things. Multiculturalism doesn't do that, right? Multiculturalism, quite for me, literally functions as this, as this attempt to repair or this attempt to include at the cost of keeping Mestizaje intact. Right. So this is where I really appreciate you even is it really an afterlife? Because, I struggle with that too. I was like, is it an afterlife? And I'm like, but the nation state thinks it's no longer mestizo, right? It literally thinks it's no longer mestizo, right? The national subject is no longer mestizo. Yet all of the folks in positions of power, right? Till this day, you won't find affirmative action doesn't exist in Honduras, right? So you won't find Black and Indigenous people en la Universidad Autónoma de Honduras o de Nicaragua o de Costa Rica, right? There's something about multiculturalism that is very much a failed project, right? And it allows for Mestizaje to remain really present and really intact. So maybe I gotta rethink that afterlife stuff. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, Omari.
Let me lower my hand before I forget. There it goes. Awesome. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and sharing your work with us again. I loved reading your chapter. I have some feedback, and there's things that I think I'll ask some questions, and obviously you don't have to answer all of them because I know we have time to open it up to other folks. But kind of going off what Shanti was saying about the afterlife of Mestizaje, I saw how that played out in the beginning of the chapter, and I felt there were moments when you were talking about the NYC examples, like Janelle, right, women, right, I was curious about, well, what is the afterlife of mestizaje here, right? Especially teasing that out more in the New York City diaspora context. It made me think about, well, if this is how it's playing out in the Isthmus, right, and in Central America and in Honduras, like, what is the continuation of that? Like, you talked about the West Coast briefly, but like, what about in New York City, right? Because there is a rise of Central Americans who are not Black moving to the East Coast, right? And what is that continuation of the afterlife of mestizaje alongside that these, you know, Garifuna women who are living in New York doing their work, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that I found so compelling that I'm like, you could do so much with this. I love that you did this whole kind of rejection and refashioning of Afro-Latinidad. And I feel like that needs to be in the title, because it's not just refashioning. There's also a very political and intentional rejection that is central to the discussion in this chapter. That, like, for example, when you were talking about the moment where she was in the salon, and I can't remember exactly who, but like the salon and Dominicans, right, being anti-Black, right? That part, I was like, okay, this is not about I mean, I don't know if these Dominicans were Black, right? Because not all Dominicans are Black, but assuming that the Dominicans in the salon were Black, right? What is the conversation there of Black Latinos having literally producing anti-Blackness and white supremacy towards other Black Latinos, right? Or what they would later recognize as Black Latinos for them, even though Garifuna, right, in particular. Like, there's something to that image, right? What does it tell us about Black embodiment and experience in the production of anti-Blackness and white supremacy that is happening in the diaspora, right, in that moment, right? Because that is the rejection of Afro-Latinidad, right? But that's also is the refashioning of Afro-Latinidad. So that discussion there would be so pivotal, right? Especially for those of us who are thinking about how do we theorize Afro-Latinidad? How do we think through, right? What are the issues with it? But also, what are the things that, what's the messiness in there? Because there is some messiness in there that I think needs to be, that it would be to flesh that out there. And then the other part that's kind of more broad, right, is just thinking about, you're writing about, for at least, you know, in this chapter, predominantly about women, right, Garifuna women. And I was wondering about the gendered framework, right, particularly about what does it mean for them as women, right, in those spaces doing that work, right? How is their experience gendered, not just women doing this work, but what is the experience of doing this work in the midst of a lot of our Central American, Latin American, Caribbean cultures are still very patriarchal, right? How do they navigate that space doing that work, especially these women who are clearly leaders, right? So I thought about that as well. So I'll shut up now, but this was wonderful, and I'm so excited.
Thank you. No, thank you so much for your comments and questions. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this space with you, and thank you. You know, thank you for pushing me on this refashioning, because I've been sitting with this refashioning for a minute, right? Because I think I'm still thinking about the rejection part. And that rejection part for me sometimes feels like a misunderstanding of what Afro-Latinidad is, right? For me, sometimes I think that rejection, because it feels like a couple of things, right? And I think sometimes I really sit down to really kind of map out in my mind, or not even on my mind, like literally on a blackboard, right? Like to map out like Garifuna New York activism, right? And I really map it out through the lens of Garifuna women, particularly because those histories remain so marginalized in the larger kind of understanding of like Garifuna New York, particularly because Garifuna men take up a lot of space, right? They're taking a lot around the limelight, right? And I'm particularly thinking about like Celio Alvarez, you know, Jose Francisco Avila, right? Like Garifuna women have been at the forefront for decades on this activism. And the rejection to me feels so generationally specific, because Ida Lambert was entirely okay with being una negra hispana, right? Was entirely okay with being una negra centroamericana, right? That there was something there was something about Latinidad, whether it was framed as Centroamericanos or framed as Hispanidad, right? That was still promising and was also about a certain kind of language-based identity, right? Cultural language-based identity that's really important to Aida and Mirta's generation. That this rejection feels so generational, but it also feels, right? Because for me, part of the rejection has to do with, okay, here's this broader social media project around the cancelization, like canceling Latinidad, right? Calling the anti-Blackness of Latinidad, the anti-Indigeneity of Latinidad. But there's also something about, you can't escape being a Martinez, right? Like you can't escape the Spanish surname. So there's something about that rejection that feels as it's a ¿cómo te digo? Like, sometimes it feels like, ¿y cuál es el punto? Right? Like, ¿cuál es el punto to reject Afro-Latinidad, right? Or at least in the beginning, right, have a journey with it. Because I think all of us could be like, yeah, there's a lot of issues with Afro-Latinidad, right? I don't want my Blackness to be an add-on to Latinidad, right? Like, I don't need it, right, to be this add-on or this hyphen. But I do need Latinidad to blow up its borders, right? Like I need Latinidad to understand that Blackness and indigeneity are foundational to this project, right? That they're not just these hyphens or add-ons from the 90s, right? But yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm like still thinking through it because there's so much there and I really want to take that moment, right? To even like build on the work of Janelle Candelario, right? Like in these spaces con el pelo and these spaces around, you know, Dominicans can't be your quintessential anti-Black Latinx subject, right? And it's this moment where Ana Castillo's like, but they are. And I was like, are they really? You know, and like, are these moments of Black affirmation, they're very much alive, right? So this is even when I turn to like, you know, Colonial Phantoms with Dixa Ramirez's work, because there are moments, right, of Black Dominicanness being affirmed, right? And Black Dominicans can't always be the quintessential anti-Black subject. Like it just can't, right? And it's also just historically not correct, right? And also around a lot of the Afro-Latinx activism in New York is made available because of Black Dominicans and Black Puerto Ricans, right? So it's also like, you know, I think it's also, you know, sometimes I think the rejection is also about Central America, right? More than anything else. Like, I think sometimes it's about, you know, Central Americans in New York, if you're Black, you fold into the Caribbean, right? You fold in, right? There, you know, it is okay and totally understandable that people read me as Dominican, right? It is totally okay that my Spanish sounds hella New Yorican, right? I grew up in a Pentecostal church right in the heart of Bushwick on the corner of Gates and Bushwick, right? Claro, you know, like, of course. So there's a lot of folding in. And I think there's something about Central American alterity that Arturo Arias talks a lot about, that this rejection, I think, has a lot to do with that too, right? There's something about Mirta and Aida that want to protect their Central Americanness, right? So they rather hang out with mestizo Central Americans, right? God, thank you so much for that comment. Like, thank you. I really appreciate you.
Oh, so interesting. Just wanted to remind other participants to please add your questions. If I don't see any questions in the Q&A, I'm just going to keep rolling with this. So please add your questions to the Q&A so that we can have Pablo talk about them. Sarah, go for it.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for this paper. I really, really appreciated reading it. One of the many things that I really appreciate about it is the way you move through all of these different types of cultural objects, both from the state as well as these different mediums of self-fashioning or sort of refashioning Blackness and indigeneity. And so I was wondering, actually, if you could talk more here about the sort of difference in these mediums. And I was particularly struck, you know, even with all the sort of caveats you've given about this generational conversation, but around the move from like sort of in-person community-based thing to something like a Facebook meme or a blog, or even the ways that this sort of in-person community building shifts in something like a picture book or a children's book. And so I was wondering if you could speak more about the use of digital technologies in the refashioning that you're talking about, given that it seems sort of present throughout the chapter, has this allowed for increased circulation of this type of rejection, perhaps this sort of hemispheric rejection of anti-Blackness? If like, how are these Facebook images circulating in that way? I'd love to hear any thoughts around that. And thank you so much for sharing this piece.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for the question. One thing about social media and the digital spaces is that, I've kind of bookmarked this idea in calling it the Arturo Alfonso Schomburg impulse. And I'm calling it that for now, particularly because there's such a contemporary project on resurrecting Schomburg and resurrecting his Black Latinx history and politics and hemispheric movements, that one thing about the digital space for Garifuna folks, right? Hashtag Garifuna on Twitter, is that it's a curation and response to how hashtag Central American Twitter has completely made Black, Indigenous, Garifuna, Creole folks invisible to that space. And I love that Garifuna folks in the social media spaces are using it as their own curation around Garifuna life, Garifuna culture. Particularly, like, if you just at any moment go to Twitter, you'll see quite literally a social media archive on Garifuna culture and how Garifuna culture is also being constructed by Garifuna folks, right? And particularly because there's a long, both intellectual history of Garifuna communities being documented on, right? And you have all of these kind of anthropologists, historians coming in and just extracting this information and going, right, and leaving, right? And I think there's something really powerful that that social media allows Garifuna folks to be their own curators, right? Their own authors in their culture and their history. And I find that to be really, really powerful.
Thank you so much. So we do have a question in the chat. Again, please keep sending us questions. Kira says, I don't have a specific question. I'm trying to take in all the greatness that has been presented over the last hour, but I would love to hear a bit more about the tensions between Black immigrants and African Americans and how that fits into this larger framework of anti-Blackness and internalized anti-Blackness being brought from Central America.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say, and Jemima Pierre's work has been so incredibly informative around this question, particularly because, she uses this notion of the ethnic shield, right? And how Black immigrants use ethnicity or also more importantly, how sociologists of immigration use these kind of cultural narratives, right? To create these tensions between Black immigrants and African Americans, right? And particularly because sociologists in many ways continue to view African American culture and peoples and communities and households as void of something, right? And Black immigrants are entering the States with this kind of global pathology around African American culture, right? So Black immigrants aren't kind of tabla rosa coming in, they're coming in with these global understandings and global realizations, right? What I think is important here to think about is that Ida, in her piece, is really concerned about the loss of Garifuna culture to African American culture. What I always ask myself is, what is it about Garifuna culture and African American culture that doesn't seem that they can be in conversation with one another, right? And once again, it's this fundamental idea that African American culture is void of something, right? And this is where kind of these larger diasporic tensions come as well, right? And I think there's something about that being a specifically generational issue, right? Ida Lambert is raising her children in East Harlem, right? Some of her children are born in Honduras, some of them are born here, but her grandchildren are attending HBCUs, right? They're marrying into African-American families, right? So she's consistently concerned by that, right? She's not just concerned in this piece, right? In her oral history, she's really concerned about this. She's terrified about the loss of Garifuna culture with this undercurrent of anti-African American sentiment, right? Because in many ways, she articulates that, well, Garifuna culture is really different. Yes, but it's Black culture, right? So what is it about Garifuna Black culture that can't be in an explicit connection and conversation, both diasporically, locally, with African American culture? And I really, one of the reasons that in my work, I really try to push back this generational sociological fixation is to get to the bottom of that, right? Is to really disrupt this kind of, you know, Mary Waters, right? This kind of idea that African American culture essentially damages generationally Black immigrants. And it's like, huh? Right? So here's these moments where it's like, absolutely not, right? And this is how this happens, right? And this is how, you know, one of the first like Afro Latinx student organizations in the US is formed in Howard University, right? In the 80s, right? Yeah, so I, you know, a lot of this is pushing back to that I, you know, I really build on Jemima Pierre's intervention here, that it's the ethnic shield reinscribes the anti-Blackness that Black immigrants also express around African American culture.
Absolutely. I think you could write a whole piece just critiquing sociologists, and I would so love that. Oh my God, please.
Listen.
Read it.
Yeah.
Read it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So we have to wrap up because we're getting close to the end here, and I want to leave a little bit of time to talk about upcoming programs in the Black Latinx Americas xLab and with Insurgent Intersections. So I first want to thank Pablo López Oro for his amazing work and this fascinating conversation. Yeah, I mean, I could talk to you for many, many more hours about everything here, but I don't want to hold everybody up. So we'll do that soon in some conference or something. So I wanted to note that Insurgent Intersections has a end of year spring webinar where we're going to be doing a retrospective of this year, all the programming, and also forming a conversation with wonderful panelists on the intersections of art, activism, and scholarship, and how that can help us produce like new forms of knowledge concerning global anti-Blackness. So thank you so much, Jenny. So Jenny has shared that flyer in the chat, and you can register at the link also in the chat, the little bit.ly link for that event. And that's going to be on April 27th, which I believe is a Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. I will pass it over now to Dr. Zamora, if you could let me know what else is going on with the Black Latinx Americas xLab, which is always a mouthful. I'm like,
I know, I'm sorry. Maybe we'll change our name and create something better and like not so mouthful. Yeah, so the Black Latinx Americas xLab, we have this, I'm gonna share my screen so I can show you all the, oh, I don't think I have sharing capabilities. That's all right. I put the link in the bio. I put the link in the bio. Oh my God, you can put it on Instagram. I put the link in the chat. We have Yelaine Rodriguez, who is an Afro-Dominican artist, educator, and curator and cultural organizer. She conceptualizes wearable art sculptures and site-specific installations, drawing connections between Black cultures in the Caribbean and United States, captured through photography and video documentation. She will be here on Monday, April 18th. At 1 p.m., she'll be doing an artist talk at Lucy Stone Hall here at Rutgers. I put in the link in the chat so you can register there for the talk, which is going to be hybrid. So it'll be in person, but it'll also be available over Zoom. And if you want to join us that way. And then at 3:50, she'll be doing an altars workshop that is student friendly, meaning primarily geared towards students, but everybody's welcome to come if you want to come. But there is limited capacity for that. So if you would like to join us, that is in person. That same link that I posted in the chat, you can register for both events, one of the events, whichever one, and then you'll receive kind of the guidelines for the workshop if you'll be joining us for that. And I'm super excited. I think this is our last event of the semester before we move on into wrapping up the semester. So I'm really excited and hope folks can join.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amaris. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank my co-PIs, Dr. Kim Butler and Dr. Casey Britton. Thank you all so much. We ask that Pablo, that you stay on because we're going to talk to you about something real quick. And Insurgent folks, if you can also stay on. Everyone else, have a beautiful weekend. Feel free to send us additional questions if you have them, and we're happy to pass them on to Pablo. So thank you all for being here. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.